and welcome to our second feature focus of the day. Thank you for joining us. We are on our feature focus, a live Q&A with Sky Hopinka today for his film Małni. And this film will be available on the platform till Saturday, October 24th on demand. So be sure to check it out and enjoy. Also, today we'll be taking questions from the live chat. So do ask questions, and we have a moderator to help facilitate that for us. I just want to say a quick miigwech to our presenting partner, Crave. And just to let you know, my name is Niki Little, and I'm the artistic director at imagineNATIVE, and I was also part of the programming committee that selected the films this year. Joining me this afternoon is Sky Hopinka. Hi, Sky.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us today. Congratulations also. I was just wondering if you could give us a little introduction to yourself to further us into your practice and into yourself as a filmmaker.
Sure, yeah. I'm Ho-Chunk and Pachunga from Wisconsin and California, respectively. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and I've been making films for the past 9 years now. I started in 2011, around the same time that I started working with Indigenous language revitalization. So those two parts of my life have been very much entwined for the last 10 years, 9 years, however long.
I was actually had a quick question about that, really. Do you think your work with film has also kind of helped you in terms of connecting with language and developing that aspect of your culture?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I actually do think that I started within like 3 months of learning how to edit my first film and getting my first language in Chinakwawa. And so they've really informed one another, not only in thinking about how I use a camera, or also like how the camera can be used for education, as well as exploration of more creative or like more complicated aspects of storytelling, but then also with my language work, just thinking about how translation is affected by who is doing the translating, and also how language is such an intangible thing that's really hard to, I don't know, explain in a lot of ways. And really the practice of speaking, or the practice of trying to find ways to communicate can happen in all sorts of ways.
And I was wondering, because just for this film, I suppose maybe we should start with the film. Can you take us and set us up with how you developed this piece and where that came from?
I can. I think the first, actually I played at imagineNATIVE in 2013. My first and only short narrative film was a film called Hui Hui, and it stars my friend Jordan, and I act in it as well. Not because I'm an actor, but because there was no one else. And that was a film that was entirely in Chinakwawa, and the purpose of that was for Jordan and I to, I don't know, make a film that just shows the language being used like in an everyday sort of setting, or in an everyday sort of way. And fast forward 4 or 5 years, when I started thinking of the feature, which is my first feature-length film, I wanted to return to Chinakwawa, and I wanted to talk to Jordan, because it's something we had been talking about, was making the short film into something longer. And it just kind of went from there and developed from there. And yeah, Jordan is someone that I've known since 2011, and Sweetwater, who's also in the film, is someone that I've known since 2006 when I first moved to Portland, Oregon. So these are two very close friends who have been in an important part of my life for the last 14 years now. That's such a long time. And it's also a film that is about language, but also about friendship, and also about, I suppose, like life and death and the afterlife.
And I was wondering, just based off of that, maybe if you could talk to not only your relation to time, because we start with the water and I was swimming upriver, downriver, and then you also end with the ocean and going into the ocean. And I was curious about how you utilize your aesthetics and your editing to think about time and to think about sort of, you know, it weaves quite in and out with the afterlife and birth, and it's just really interesting to me. And so I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit more about that. Yeah,
I mean, I never felt held back or bound to chronology in terms of how the film is edited together. I would have these sections or have these blocks of these sequences and just move them around back and forth as I was trying to figure out what the sequencing is for the film. And so it was like guided more by a relationship to, I guess, these different locations and a broader sort of trajectory or arc that wasn't necessarily tied to what first happened and what happens next and what happens next and what happens next, but more like the emotional resonance around these different topics. I think like I don't know how obvious it is, but I mean, there's a sequence with Sweetwater and I where she's talking about this time where we went to the waterfall, and like that's what appears at the end of the film, near the end of the film, and I mean, it's just about that relation of water and not necessarily being too tied or guiding an audience through deciphering what the time is, but rather just what the emotional resonance is. And for me, the ocean, which is the space, the liminal space between the spirit world and the land of the living, is a way to return and to bookend the film in such a way that's, I don't know, offers this different sort of way to contemplate these spaces.
I think I feel like that part was so fascinating, and every time I keep returning to the film, there is a different layer that's sort of revealed, or a different notion to time, and it really kind of felt like, you know, some of the stories or teachings that I've been told, and in time is kind of going forward, but it's also going backwards and then forward and back. It kind of like oscillates, and I really got that from the work, and it really connected with me quite quickly. And I was wondering if you could speak to not only sort of the layering with the images, but also your use of sound, your use of the layer, like where there's a lot of water, there's a lot of drums, there's different elements. If you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, like even in terms of like abstracted images, I tend to use that approach in other short films that I've made to represent or to acknowledge these different ways of understanding the world that are hard to explicitly explain through a film. And with this film itself, I felt like the proper course was to not abstract images or to overlay a lot of images, and rather just to let them be. And so that opened up another opportunity for me to work with the sound more, or to not have like sync sound or the sound from the locations that I was shooting at guide the film. Rather, how could I layer them or bring different sound elements from different spaces and build a sound or create a sound or replicate what it sounds like being on a canoe, even if the sound from that canoe is something that I didn't use. And so like that sort of assemblage or ways of trying to create a soundscape and play with the left and right channel, and that's stereo space, was a way to like just branch off or just add another layer to the images that offered an abstracted view of looking at them rather than abstracting them themselves, which for me in this film was a more specific or direct way, or I don't know, subtle way of letting a viewer interpret the film however they feel.
And I think it really it quite worked, because quite well, I guess I'm saying, is because I noticed when I was watching, like, you know, I'd be in a specific moment, and whether it be like a micro view of plants or nature, and then the sound that was maybe in a different scene, or that I would relate to a different scene, really brought me back to an emotional spot in that one, and as I was moving forward with the film. So I really enjoyed that. And I was wondering, actually, so we not only do we have your film, but I sort of asked you a random question if you'd want to collaborate with us or just kind of see what would happen while thinking through experimental film and also through an Indigenous lens. And I'm so happy that you were on board. So thank you so much. Because I know even in it, you asked, you're sort of like, why me? And I really like that moment. And just for the viewers, it's called Decolonial Experimental. It's on the platform. Check it out. It's a commission that we had, that Sky jumped in with us. And I would say it's like a visual essay or an expanded artist talk. And it's really lovely. And I think just thinking about, you know, you can see your assemblages within the works there and how you're working through them. And then also to hear you just speak now about how, you know, maybe your visuals, less assemblage, but then the sound element really is like quite different, but can get a sense of already your practice and your trajectory and your process. I was wondering if you could speak how you approached this expanded artist talk.
Very carefully. and reluctantly. I realized once I started working on it that I would have to talk into a camera and record myself. That just felt really foreign to me, and really uncomfortable, because then I realized I would have to edit this, and I really didn't want to have to edit video of myself. And so just trying to think about the ways that are easiest for me to talk about work or to talk about what I'm thinking through. And it's often just like talking to people. Um, so I don't know, like I stood up and recorded me going on and on for 40 minutes about what I think about cinema. And it's less of a rant. It's more of, I think, just wandering through these works that I've made. I think the earliest one is from 2013, 2014. It's called Wawa, and that's in there in its entirety, as is a film I made called Jaji Aprox by my father. That film's there in its entirety. And I'm just using this as an opportunity to unpack some of those things I've been thinking about or think through with cinema and Indigenous cinema, and what that means or has the opportunity to mean, and where I fit into all this, these conversations around what things look like for the future.
And I think that's really great, because I think oftentimes when we're sort of unpacking work or trying to talk about like what could Indigenous cinema be, where, without trying to put it into genres. And I really liked the fact that you asked the audience questions, sort of, you know, not only pushing our interpretation of it, but also you introspectively talking to yourself as an artist and pushing yourself. And I thought that was so intriguing, because, you know, I do hope for those types of conversations where, as a collective or as Indigenous artists, we can continue to talk about our practice in an elevated way and to be able to like push those theories and those aesthetics forward. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit further about to the archive and your relationship. And there's so many moments of care that you speak about, especially with the cassettes with your father's recordings on it. And I think there's specific actions of you driving that, for me, that really resonated, that kind of speak to your practice as well. And so I was wondering if you could talk to sort of that proximity to kin through the archive.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think my first, like with those recordings that I made of my dad, I made them over the course of 10 years. And it was something that I had made for, I guess, like not so much for historicizing my father, but rather just like, here's some tapes. How can I talk to him and how can I learn these songs? And just like, you know, hear his voice. And then through that, you know, I started thinking more about the abstraction, or just like what happens to an archive and when one is removed from it. What happens when you hear, you know, your grandfather, your grandmother, a distant relative in some archive that was recorded in the 1930s? How does that affect your relationship to them? And it was that intimacy that is captured in these different moments of archival materials that I'm often more interested in than the information that is presented, because it offers more of an insight. And I don't want to say it's voyeuristic, but it's more intimate in terms of hearing two people like talk and laugh, or when they forget to turn the recorder off and it's just small talk, and it may be distance and you can't hear it that well, but you can hear them talking, you can hear the tone of their voice, you can hear, I don't know, just a sense of familiarity and friendship. And like that intimacy is what interests me in a lot of archival materials, because then it's a way of looking at these materials not as materials or objects, but rather as parts, or how to have different relationships with them. I mean, like I mentioned in the talk, that, you know, a question I ask myself, or what I wonder through sometimes, is, do I have more of a relationship with these recordings that I made of my dad than my dad himself? I mean, it's not a question with an answer, but it's a question that I think opens up these different possibilities to engage with these different materials and these different things that we have that come from the past, and how they also can exist in the present.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also to not only is that you can get that sense, but I also, you know, Indigenous folk to archives or relation to recording, especially early on, is so heavy. There's a mixed relationship. And so I think this one, and then the way it is brought forward, there is an intimacy that you're talking about there, especially like maybe some of the actions that you and your father are doing, echoing each other, him driving on the powwow trail, you driving across and visiting folks. Like, it does become this different element. And sometimes it brought me to like some concepts around like what it is around ghosts, or I read this one thing where it was like, these things are sort of like ghosts, but they're finding us, as opposed to us like encountering them or like voyeuring to like find them and to explore them, but they're coming like a return to us. And I really got that sense, and it really kind of brought me back to that within your work. I was wondering if you could also just talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about time and also to water. And I was thinking if you could talk to, I like the moment when Jordan's talking about his hair and his hair growing. And I just wondered like how sort of did that scene come about, or how was it just a conversation? Or I just thought that was a beautiful moment too, especially thinking about like Indigenous masculinity and just like that in that interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, like we were sitting at the camp in the canoe journey, at the tribes camp, and just like visiting and just talking about stuff in Chinook. And I just realized I never asked Jordan about his hair. And I don't know if I should, but then it's like something that he started to grow long after I met him. And I know that it's a complicated thing to talk about. So I just asked him, and I don't know, we had this really like nice conversation about it. And I think that it gives a lot of insight into a lot of these different things around Indigenous masculinity, toxic or not, and even just like how gender affects, I don't know, these communities, whether it's Grand Ronde or a different community, and how it's, I don't know, it's a complicated topic. And even just like him sharing that little bit was a nice way to, I don't know, foreground a lot of the conversations we've also had around what do these things look like, whether it is how we identify and how our identities are not necessarily prescribed to us, but how we have control over that prescription, or control over how we want to be seen and perceived. And I don't know, just like it felt appropriate too to have it just like that one long take and not put B-roll over it, and just to be conversational and to show those moments of wondering and trying to find the right words, whether it's in English or Chinook, and just trying to speak as we speak. And yeah, that's like how a lot of the different conversations came about in the film, where it's just, I don't know, it's like for Jordan talking about things that are close to him or that he hadn't thought about before, or talked about before, or even Sweetwater, just talking with her about the things that, I don't know, she didn't want to talk about. And I think often in these sorts of interviews that come from like a more documentarian sort of way, or more of an ethnographic tradition, you know, it's not about the information that is said on tape is the information that matters, but is often what's not said and what's left out. And I think those gaps and the silences are equally as important in giving insight into, I mean, where they're both coming from and where they're both trying to go.
And that leads me to my next question, around sort of how you articulate or how you approach, as a viewer. There's sort of like, I don't want to say insider outsider moment, but there's also like a revealing, if you will, like you're revealing so much. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that and how you articulate that within the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about that. I mean, especially with my earlier films, I think those were more reactions against ethnographic and anthropological film traditions. And it's something that, I mean, I think I've stuck with in terms of just like a nonfiction sort of format, where it's less about commenting directly on ethnographic and anthropological film traditions. But there's a distinction that was made by one of my mentors, and I don't want to mess it up. Well, it's fairly simple, but it's one of those things you can get backwards. But the difference between the observing participants and participating observer, and how those distinctions matter in a certain sort of way. And am I an observer who's a participant, or a participant who's also an observer? You know what I mean? It's like being in a community or outside of community. And what does it mean to be in a community with a camera as opposed to being outside of one? And how does that guide what the camera shows? And also what's revealed or explained in a didactic way, or in a way that comes out of the subtext or the assemblage or the edits. And I mean, I really don't like to explain too much in the work, but rather just present the camera in a space and let an audience either they know where it's at or what's going on or have a sense, which is often what I'm thinking about with an Indigenous audience that's watching the work as opposed to a white one or a non-Indigenous one, and how much access they have just based on their own experiences or understanding. And it's not a way to create hierarchies, but it's just a way to focus what I want to focus on and have conversations about what I want to have conversations about without being obliged to contextualize or explain or teach a non-Indigenous audience.
Yeah, I think that also, like, that really does speak to sort of, can speak to labor in terms of how much work, where you are as an audience in terms of like how you relate to the work. I think you speak to a lot of things that can be embodied, a lot of different ways that Indigenous folks transmit knowledge. And so I really appreciate you sharing those words. We did have one question, and I know we're running out of time, but it's a good question to end on. Someone was wondering if you could share what you're working on next.
Yeah, I was hoping to be starting on a project around powwows this summer, but you know, everything happens. So I'm still working on that, just trying to figure out like what that is going to be about or like how it looks. So I'm hoping to shoot next summer or the summer after that. Mm-hmm. And there's also a 3-channel installation that I'm just finishing up right now. It just opens this past weekend, and I'm still working on it, but it's looking at these different homelands. I'm currently in Hudson, New York, which is the territorial homeland of the Stockbridge-Muncie Band of Mohegan Indians. And they were removed to Wisconsin, to an area which is like my traditional homelands in Ho-Chunk. And I don't know, there's just like kind of like parallel. There's like the relationship between these two tribes, and I'm trying to tie those together through this 3-channel installation, as well as some archival recordings of Vine Deloria Jr. and an interview that I did with Indigenous scholar. Her name's Renia Ramirez. She's a Ho-Chunk author, academic, and she talks about this idea around her, like the Native Hub. And there's a few other elements, but it's touching on these just sort of things around history and lands and the collapsing of the past and the present.
That sounds interesting. Where is it, and where is that opening, or where is that going to be?
That's at it's the Hessel Museum, which is part of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. It opened this past Saturday, but due to the pandemic, they're restricting it to Bard faculty and students for the next few weeks. But it'll be up until February 14th next year. And I'm hoping also to perhaps get it installed in other places.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to seeing the documentation from there. I have a question for you afterwards. But thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Everyone go check out the work. Decolonial Experimental is going to be up on this platform for the duration of the festival. And Małni is going to be up until today's Thursday, Friday, till Saturday. So you have time to watch then. And as always, thank you for joining us. Tomorrow, Darlene Ponce will be for our first feature focus at 2 p.m. tomorrow for Legend of Bear and Toa. And continue to look at the website for updates and all the exciting programs. And thank you again for joining us. Take care.